In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you.
What happens when an aggressive foreign animal is introduced into an environment populated by a homegrown local animal? The answer is this. That foreign animal outcompetes the local animal population for scarce resources and increases its population at the expense of the local animal population as a reward for its success. So let's do some math so we can understand what is going on, how this population transfusion is taking place, and what it will result in. There are now approximately 41 million people of African descent living in the United States. However, if we subtract all black people born between 1945 and 1964, which amounts to about 7 million people, then we get a truer picture of what to expect in the year 2050, because that 7 million people are the baby boomers, black people born at a time between 1945 and 1964. And by 2050, all of them, except for those that live over 100 years or so, are going to be dead. And right now, they are retiring from work and no longer part of the active population, increasingly every day. And that will continue for the next 18 or so years. If we do that, the active population of black people would now be 34 million people. Once we subtract the 7 million, now we're left with 34 million. We're left with 34 million African American children and adults. But we must subtract some more. We must subtract again, because 8% of that number are immigrants. That amounts to 3,250,000 people from Africa, some from the Caribbean. They constitute the foreign population introduced into the local environment, now dominated by African Americans who are descendants of slaves. And since they are people of African descent, this is not something that you're going to notice on a daily basis. You're just going to say, oh, that's a black person. And that's true. But those immigrants have a different cultural orientation. They have different values. Now, once we subtract that number, the number of descendants of slaves actually right now in the active population and who are young is about 30,250,000 people. The growth of immigrant Africans from Nigeria, from Ethiopia, and Eritrea has been steady at about 2% per every 2 years since 1980. And you should be able to notice that. That should be very noticeable now. I have noticed that in every major city that I've traveled through. So if we assume that 2%, that a 2% growth rate will remain constant, this is what we get. By 2050, greater than 35% of the black population of 66 million will be young immigrants and descendants of immigrants, while the population of descendants of slaves will be about 34 million people, the same that it is today. But, and this is extremely important, it will be composed primarily of African American descendants of slaves who are over 50. And as a consequence, with fewer black people who are in the fertile years, resulting in a even lower fertility rate than we have today. And today, of course, remember, it's 1.8. So we're talking about a fertility rate of 1, which is, when you study demographics, is not replacement level reproduction. And that means your population is going out. You project to the year 2100. There will have been nearly a complete transformation of the African American population from being composed primarily of African people who are descendants of slaves to African people who are descendants of immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean and so forth. You may ask, well, why is this happening? Why are they out competing? Why are they accessing resources more effectively, more successfully? After all, the descendants of slaves have been here for 400 years. Well, there are some very specific reasons that we can see statistically. Let's look at the marriage difference. 48% of African immigrants are married. Only 28%, as I said, to 32% of African Americans who are descendants of slaves are married. What that means is that they're able to raise their children more efficiently, supervise their children, give direction to their children, monitor them. Their poverty rate is lower. And that makes sense, because if you've got two parents, you might have two incomes, and that's better than one income. And of course, it suggests that fewer of them are on welfare and other forms of state aid. 20% of them are poor compared to 33% of African Americans who are descendants of slaves. Let's look at college. 26% of African immigrants successfully complete college, compared to 19% of African Americans who are descendants of slaves. And I've taught for over 30 years, and I have observed the difference between African students who are immigrants versus African American students. And generally, African immigrants work harder and they do better academically, which to me proves that there's a cultural reason for the many problems which African Americans who are descendants of slaves suffer from in the United States. Jamaicans, Nigerians, Ethiopians, Eritreans excel in the class. Let me tell you one story. An Eritrean friend of mine who wanted to become a nurse told me that on the first day of one of her classes, there were about a dozen African Americans, including her. The others, however, were African Americans, descendants of slaves. And she stated that by the end of the semester, she was the only African person who had successfully completed the class. The others had dropped out. They couldn't or didn't do the work. And her teacher came up to her and said that she was surprised that she completed the class. Of course, she scored an A in the class. And that's the point that I've been trying to make. They work harder. And it's not because they are more intelligent. It's not because they come from another place. Their DNA is the same as the DNA of African Americans, descendants of slaves. It's because they have had a different cultural experience and they are participating in a different culture, which is more positive and which in many ways is free from the burden of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Their fertility rate is much higher. For the time being, it's between 3 and 4 children per female between 15 and 45. And I've said to you a couple of times, the African American descendant of slaves fertility rate right now is about 1.8. And of course, I've cited to you the abortion statistics. I don't know what the abortion statistics are for immigrant Africans, but I would presume that it's very low because of their beliefs compared to the beliefs now in the African American community, which are very different from what African Americans, descendants of slaves, believed 50 years ago. The United States is one big economic marketplace, like a flea market. And in that marketplace today, descendants of slaves have no valuable resources and thus have no utilitarian value in today's marketplace. It is a marketplace. And what you have to have in the marketplace to remain valuable in the marketplace is you have to have resources, or at least you have to have your capacity to do manual labor. Now that has been diminished because of the loss of manufacturing jobs. Or you have to have the intellectual skills to fit into the marketplace as it is today. And with the loss of value in the marketplace, individuals and groups are discarded. A place is found for them somewhere, like prison or AFDC, but that's only temporary. Plus, we suffer from the traumatic slave syndrome. That illness manifests in 1,000 ways and on a daily basis. The only treatment for it is the elimination of the structures of white supremacy. But white supremacy and white supremacists have power, and they will not give it up nor share that power and wealth with black people. Period. Don't expect it. It's never going to happen. For these reasons, the black narrative will change completely. The narrative that we have grown to be accustomed to is changing, and it's going to change even faster. It will cease to be a narrative framed by the unique experiences of the descendants of slaves, and instead, it will become a narrative framed by a more economically and educationally aggressive and agreeable group of black people who are descendants of immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. They will have no concern about slave history unless they are from the Caribbean islands, and they will be a minority. Nor will they want to identify with it now, nor will they want to identify with it in the future. They have no emotional or historical connection to the experience of descendants of slaves. Now, this is going to happen whether or not you accept the facts I have presented. It doesn't matter. I'm telling you the facts. You go and get these facts. You do your analysis. And if you allow the facts to guide you, you're going to be compelled to arrive at the same conclusion. If descendants of slaves don't care about each other the way other groups care about themselves, as a group, as a unique group, they're going to cease to exist meaningfully in the United States. Now, what that means is that there will be new spokespersons for the black community. New people are going to rise up and define a new narrative. It also means a transition back to black male leadership within the black communities, as the numbers of black females decrease over time by aging and lowered fertility. Now, think of it this way. Right now, if you really pay attention, you will notice black women are taking the leadership roles in communities throughout this nation. Black Lives Matter was founded by a group of sisters. That is right now a fact because of the extreme loss of black males. But eventually that plays out. Most of your college degrees are being awarded to black women, but eventually that plays out because they'll spend years and years in college. They'll become professionals. They will have one child. And as you see over time, that will decrease the numbers of black people. And that in turn will cause a decrease in the number of black women who get degrees. You see, it's all tied to reproduction rates. And so we can expect within the next 20 years to see a rapid decline in the vocal leadership of black females who are descendants of slaves. But at the same time, we will see that descendants of African immigrants will be chosen by the elite to be the spokespersons to define the narrative of black people in the United States. And it will no longer be a relevant narrative to those of us who are tied to the history of slavery. And that is the demographic transfusion that is taking place. And it is just simply something that is happening and that is going to happen because we have lost control of the ball. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.